Skugtash, Andrew Martinez. My name is Andrew Martinez. I'm a research specialist with the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona. And today we have Chanae Bullock, who is the CEO of Moskehtu Consulting. And 2 weeks ago, she helped us out and presented to our entire Udall Center staff, speaking on anti-Blackness in Indian country. And so I'm going to shift it over to Chanae. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, Nadasuwi Sakampanayu Mashuna Tuyuskwa, Wachi Shinnecock, Wachi Pamanaki. My given name is I Lead Canoe. I'm Butterfly Woman, and I come from the people known as the people of the Stony Shore, right in Southampton, Long Island, New York. And it's an honor to be here again. And as you said, I am the owner of Moskehtu Consulting, which is a cultural and heritage preservation firm.
All right, thank you for that introduction. So we have a list of questions that we'll be going over with Chanae today. First is, please share what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you and why they are important, particularly in applied academic settings like ours. So institutions such as ours, you work with various institutions and other companies as well with your consulting business.
Yeah, so to me, diversity and inclusion means just that. A lot of times, this is a very popular phrase that's being used, but a lot of people that meet some of those different intersectionalities are often left out of the whole conversation. So when I think of diversity and inclusion, I mean just that. I mean diversified, all walks of life, intergenerational, interracial, all different creeds and backgrounds coming together to be included in various topics or projects, opportunities, and in the sense of the academic institutions, it's important because when we go back historically to academic institutions, specifically dealing with the minority, whatever that may be, a lot of times it was to assimilate that particular group to fit the rest of this, the country. Now we're kind of having to bring in the diversity in the classroom so that we can each see the different perspectives on a specific topic. Before it was kind of just a one mind, one track. There wasn't any room for diversity and inclusion. So I think now bringing this into an institution is very useful, whether that's on the board level, committee level, faculty, staff, student, the classroom itself, because that it's going to take all of us being able to, one, recognize the differences, respect the differences, but allow space for there to be differences.
And as far as bringing in curriculum, also, I know certain states are passing bills to institute, the Indian history or Native American history of that state and what happened. And so that development is happening. So seeing that diversity inclusion there, I think is important, but it also brings its challenges as well. And so now that the bills are passed in certain states, the implementation part of that is the challenging part. And that's kind of where we're at. But at the same time, it's also an exciting point to be engaged in this space, is because the change is actually happening. It's just our responsibility. It's on us to get that going now. All right, thank you for that response. Second question is, what is your approach to understanding the perspectives of colleagues, friends, acquaintances from different backgrounds?
Well, my approach, I think maybe because I know that I have a very unique background, right? Just as an Indigenous woman. So I think I have it in my mind that someone else has something different to offer. So I'm very open. I think observation and being very reserved and just doing more listening when you're dealing with someone that has a different background is very important, as opposed to me projecting, oh, this is how we do it, or this is what my people do, or this is how I see it. Rather than just kind of being more quiet and observant, you begin to really learn that, wow. And then you get to see what the similarities are. And then you get to see what those differences are. In our communities, we believe that In our indigenous communities, we believe that our differences are what makes us unique, and that's also what makes us strong. My people being people of the Stony Shore, there's really no other person or people called that. So we are very specific to that responsibility, to that particular region. And that makes us strong and knowledgeable within that. But if someone is of the grasslands or of different places, they have different stories that makes them unique to that particular part. But all of these different stories and backgrounds and cultures coming together collectively can actually create like a global well-being of people. So I kind of look at it as being able to just learn about it. For some people, they're very curious and they want to do it, and then they want to be experts at that, what they learned. And then that alone creates, I think, more division, because it's an insult, it's cultural appropriation, and that's a whole different topic. But for me, my take is really just being observant and being a little bit more reserved, and just embracing the unique differences, but noticing what the similarities are, and then that's what I find. How can I be relatable to a people that is different than me?
And to speak to your point about your community, traditional pronunciation, Tana Atam, my people, Tana translates to desert, and Atam translates to people. And so we have Akama Atam, who are river people, North Phoenix area, and then Tana Atam people who are south, or I should say west of Tucson. And so those descriptors, like there's a lot we can talk about. It goes back and forth of how we utilize the landscape and steward the landscape, not only in the desert, but also for your people along the shores as well. And so it's really interesting to listen to that point and reflect back on how I've had to even as a Thanatam person, just listen to community members, not even say anything, but just engage and just listen to learn. And I think that's a very important point. Thank you for that response. Okay, so question 3, how can we advance equitable outcomes for students and young professionals?
Well, I think that, let's start with students. Well, we can start with young professionals, because you become a young professional after you're a student. So then there's sort of a responsibility that you have in your professional field or your professional path to create opportunity for students to become young professionals as you go on to be an older professional, or whatever it is. So the opportunities are it's just a cycle. We always talk about within our communities, the seventh generation, right? Thinking about the seventh generation prior to us and the seventh generation before us. So what we do, we take that ancient wisdom from those 7 generations and prior behind us to create opportunity for those that are coming in forward. So when we say young professionals, for myself, right, I've worked in corporate America. I once was a student in different places, right, in the institution of college, but also a student of medicine teachers, a student of historians, a student of traditional keepers within my community. And now I guess, I'm one of those that I'm able to now lead ceremony. I'm able to now lead some of these different community events within my community. But I'm also able to, I went from working as an intern to a managerial position, and now I'm able to own my own business. So with that, it's my job to give back to the students who were once in my position to create those opportunities. And once you're able to do that, then you're able to create economic sustainability, because you're not taking those resources and putting them out elsewhere. You're taking those resources, strengthening those resources, and redistributing them through the community, recreating or creating a whole different opportunity, possibly a whole different department, if you will. And we see that through the evolution of education, with terms such as diversity and inclusion. If we were to talk about diversity and inclusion back in the 40s, that really wasn't a thing. But it took those students to become young professionals, to write books, to write dissertations, to create departments, to protest. You create opportunity for departments, jobs, careers, and so that's kind of what I see is that, the giving back to the community, whether it's in the academic or in, our actual traditional communities.
It's giving back to create institutional and lasting changes. That's what you're getting at, or at least that's what I'm hearing and how I'm processing that is going through the process. And I know some folks are just okay with developing and moving forward career-wise and professionally, but there are those of us who actually care about, like, well, I had to go through this process. It wasn't great. How can we change it for the future? How can we develop it and improve upon it? Just because something is implemented doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be assessed or shouldn't be assessed and improved moving forward as well. And so, yeah, you're able to have this growth, as you spoke to, economically, create different departments and create different opportunities for up and coming students as well in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great answer. Love that one. Okay, question 4. What advice do you have for educators and researchers when it comes to using emerging technology and data in ways that are effective and anti-racist?
A
big question.
It is. Because that anti-racist part just brought a whole different thing in there. So we are moving in a time that technology is outdating itself by every 6 months. For example, there's a couple of new apps that were developed, new social media apps that were developed within these last 6 months that are still in beta mode and have over 10 million people on them. But at the same time, I think that we could say this during the pandemic, people have been able to find very unique ways to utilize technology to continue the work that they're trying to do. You know what I'm saying? And it's kind of forced those that were not even doing anything with technology because it was too hard, or, they're not of that generation that just picks this up. And then you also you were really forced because budget cuts. You couldn't hire any interns. You couldn't bring in anybody new. And they kind of kept all those that stayed in tenure into some of these positions. So you were really forced to understand how to utilize technology for the advancement of whatever project or institution or initiative, that you're working on. So I find that, one, technology is great because it bridges the gaps intergenerationally. It forces the older generation and the young generation to communicate. I know for a fact, just working in corporate America, that's usually what happens. You'd always have all of the people that work in the tech department were usually of a younger age, and they were always the ones that had to come in and reboot or troubleshoot or give a new lecture on a new software that the institution is going to use and things. And it provides insight to those that are older to say, wow, we have some young people that are very talented. But as far as I would say within our indigenous community, sometimes it's a little difficult because it's I don't want to say I don't want to use the word foreign to our culture. Maybe the digital aspect of technology is a little different, but we've always been very innovative in the technologies that we've been able to use, whether that's environmental technology, finding ways for the environment to have different forms of technology for our community, through pyramids or canoe making, all of these different types of things. There's a way that we've always been able to do that. But there were laws against our way of living. So, there was a gap in us using some of these traditional technology techniques, if you will, But moving into a digital space, we're able to find that, we're able to digitalize historical records, historical archives that in turn are helping us in some of our environmental battles, in some of our land cases, in some of our, we talk about paper genocide. A lot of this stuff is now being digitally archived, for the collection of data and things like that. Even when it comes to our endangered or endangered species of medicinal plants. Some of our young people are helping with our environmental departments to capture that data and to watch the process as we begin to go back and rehabilitate, our coastline or our hiking trails or our medicinal trails. We're able to kind of capture the data digitally on the evolution of the growth based upon what we're contributing to it. So there's many different ways, but I definitely see that now more than ever, like I said, with the pandemic, that we've had to kind of be forced into that digital space. And it's been an interesting ride because through that you've been able to see so much innovation. I think through technology, and we can just say social media alone, Indigenous Peoples Day of 2020 probably was the most that was the most time we had that much awareness on us as a people, because we were all forced to watch the technology. So the technology, I think it's very important. I think, all over the world we were able to know about what's happening everywhere. I mean, we wouldn't have known what was literally happening in China if it wasn't for social media. You know, So I think that there is some benefit of it. But I think the best thing for any community to do is figure out how does it fit into the algorithms of your community, for the betterment of your community.
That's a good way of looking at it. How does it fit into the algorithms of the community? For us, just to kind of respond back to that, your response is some of us, and I, are doing work around data sovereignty and working with researchers, or kind of not necessarily, no, in some cases playing somewhat of an advisory role on data sovereignty. And you mentioned libraries, archives, and looking at a specific example, some of us are starting to work with repositories. And so they have these large repositories of photos, antiques, basically our relatives in some cases. And they're actually looking to shift the change and add a deeper story to those. Work with communities to provide more metadata, basically, like instead of an object saying, or a photograph saying Indian Pacific Northwest, finding out what community that location's from, trying to track down, like, hey, is this a family member of someone in the community? Do you know their name? Do you know the place that this was taken? And provide that sort of feedback so it can actually tell a better story that, can also benefit the community in the long run as well.
Wow. It's interesting that you bring that up because, so I've worked in a couple of, there's museum software, that most museums that, have to be NAGPRA compliant, fit, they have to have it. And there's a database that's essentially with any of the Smithsonian affiliated museums that you enter in the collections. But it's interesting because as an Indigenous woman, who is knowledgeable of technology, the use of it. It's not like, yeah, we might be the front house because we're given the tour, but it's really our generation that has become very tech savvy to be able to sit down with an Excel spreadsheet, knowing how to input all these different formulas and things like that. And when you really go back into the archives of what has essentially been archived into some of these repositories, you're literally reading just that tall, dark Indian man from the region of the Northeast. And it's like, wow. There's, jingle dresses that literally were probably worn at a powwow because you can tell it's a very contemporary wear. And the anthropologist that might have put it in there just says ceremonial wear of a 14-year-old girl. And it's like any native would know that definitely has a number on it still from the powwow. Like, it's not quite a ceremonial dress. So it really takes the natives, I think, to begin to work in some of these positions. But for a long time, what, and this is why I started Moskehtu Consulting, the actual reason is because if you weren't holding a PhD, you weren't able to really access these positions to sit and do this work, archival work, of some of these, well-known institutions. If you didn't have letters behind your name, they weren't have you do that. And so the majority, there weren't that many natives, I know within our region, that went that far at that time. So when we go into the database now, we have to go back and fix all of what was said. And that information is very useful in people's research. And it's just, we have to fix it.
And then there may be some cases where you come across some photographs or items that you may or may not want public, or the community may or may not want public, but have been public forever just because, how it was labeled, it didn't matter. And so addressing those issues as well. Definitely there. And I understand like not having the letters behind your name as well. You have to be recognized within Western society. Well, while you may have the indigenous background and understanding and education in your culture, without those letters of a master's or a PhD student, you're not hitting the qualifications of those institutions. So yeah.
Right. And how do you protect your culture, and how do you protect the spirituality of some of those items? And that, in many ways, we find as that was we can say the word institutional racism, but that was literally kind of like the divider there that prevented you from going that far in protecting your ancestors. Because although you have that knowledge, oh, you can't come through this door unless you have this key or this degree, if you will, to sit up here with us while we study your ancestors and get it wrong. You know what I mean? So, but that's really awesome that you guys are doing that. And thank you for that work, because it's needed.
It is very much needed. And I'm new to this area, but I'm happy to be engaging in it because through conversations like this and previous conversations with folks who work in libraries and archives as well, it's nice to see that there is a desire to advance this sort of work, to bring in community members, to engage community members, and to understand what these photographs and artifacts and relatives mean to communities as well. Good combo. Okay, so on to question 5. From your perspective, what is the most useful change we could implement to address the inequalities present in higher education? You kind of spoke to that earlier with the professionals and students and getting to that institutional and lasting changes.
So I think that this is a great question, because it kind of sums up all the questions, right? When you get into the diversity and inclusion, right? Having diversity and inclusion, not only in the classroom, but also on the board level, and the committee level, and the faculty level. Because once you have that, when new curriculum is made, you'll have that other perspective, the different diverse perspectives. When ideas for events are happening, or partnerships or things like that are supposed to be impactful and are for positive change, it's not just a one-track mind that you have making these essential decisions or even final approvals. And it's been a long time coming for that, because back in the day, we get into the conversation of boarding schools, you didn't have the native people being the teachers. You didn't have them as faculty or even the cook or anything like that. And if we had, we might have seen a difference in the students, and a difference in the institution. The only natives that were in there were the kids that were being institutionalized. So I think that when you can kind of diversify the entire institution, than any kind of thing, be it controversial, be it, for the well-being of the minds of everybody there, or for the students, or even just the faculty, or the extended family, that is, or the alumni. The alumni might have always wanted something like this to happen. And when they began to see that, then, it makes them proud to see the change in their own institutions sometimes. So I think across the board, all of those different levels that make up an entire institution has to kind of have that diversity and inclusion, at leadership levels and all different kinds of levels. And from there, then the conversation and relationship is going to be able to be had. That student will then see themselves as a teacher. They'll them see themselves as a dean. They'll see themselves as leaders, as businessmen and women, as alumni, as donors. You'll be able to see those yourself in all of those different places, and the work that you're putting in has that same frequency and energy in it, that lacks some of the oppressive energy. You know what I mean? Because sometimes we're not even thinking of those, or just, we don't speak about it. We're thinking about it, but we don't speak about it. I was the only Native and African American woman in my graduating theater class in New York City. And I wanted to do a play for August, about August Wilson, but I was brought into the dean of theater at the time, or the head of the theater department, and he told me that that wasn't possible because we didn't have enough people of color in the school to audition. And I said, yes, we do. You guys just don't put them on the main stage. We have plenty of people. We had 300 people audition for my play. 300 people, and the majority of them were people of color who, a lot of times, they don't audition for other plays because they just don't believe that they're going to get the part. So here's a school not even seeing half of the students that are actually qualified. So when you actually have people like myself of color in a director position, you get to see a whole energy from your institution you would have never ever seen because you've removed the oppression. So I think that when we start to implement, like, those, weave those different types of things into our institutions, we'll be able to see a way better outcome, not only in an institution, but what's going to go throughout the world,
Start to change some of these institutions, which clearly weren't built for us, people of color. Like, right? It's definitely something that's upfront and in our faces these days, is like the changes that, if you want to make an institutional change at your company or start your own, you see where those roadblocks and barriers to entry are.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a follow-up question, if we can add a sixth question to this, and this actually came from your, it came from your most recent Instagram post on Moskehtu that I saw this morning. And it's a photo of you both in your traditional regalia and your business suit. And I think it definitely speaks to the duality of Indigenous peoples in the 21st century. And it gets to the point, and reflecting back on your last response there, is like, when you see these deans and when you see these people or like Indigenous peoples filling these larger professional roles, how is that balance made between your professional role and your cultural roles as well, and remaining whole in that? So maybe just to phrase this all together, how do we continue to, or what is some advice for Indigenous students, Indigenous professionals, on balancing your role both as a professional and as a cultural practitioner as well?
Yeah, that's a great. I'm really glad you saw that because so that photo. Well, first I want to say the caption of that was, I cannot separate who I am from who I am because I can't. Um, and just for the sake of the audio, it is literally a concept that I had in mind. I had a photo shoot I had to do in October, And, I needed some new professional photos, but I wanted some in my regalia as well, my traditional clothing. So, but while I was in the photo shoot, I told the photographer, I said, what would be cool is for me to stand in the same exact position in both outfits. And then I would love to create a concept where we can split that photo. So you see one side of me in my traditional clothing and the other side in my quote unquote professional clothing, because I cannot separate myself. That part of me will never just be left at the door, so to speak, right? When they tell you leave your attitude at the door. Well, I can't leave who I am at the door, you know. And I struggled with that, right? I think we all do. But that was always the concept: kill the Indian, save the man, right? Like that was legitimate. That's on like federal documents, like legit. And that was a practice that was had since Harvard, Radcliffe, Dartmouth, in the 16 and the 1700s. All the way up until even sometimes today, we see it. They're asking our boys to cut their hair. They're asking, if you could pass for white, then you don't say that you're Native. There's a lot of those things, but we're living in a time where it's actually okay to walk in. I think today is the final hearing, or has been the final hearing for Deb Holland. And with that being said, here we finally get to see a Native woman walk into the White House with her traditional skirt or her traditional pottery, or her traditional silver work. That's important, I think, to us as a people to see that she doesn't have to leave that at the door. Yes, she might have a suit on, but she hasn't left her traditional side. So the balance that I have found is that, one, you have to be comfortable within yourself, but you also have to know where you come from and what your real purpose is. And know that, yeah, there's going to be a lot of talk. There's going to be, what are you doing? Or why are you wearing that? And all of that. And sometimes you might be the only Indigenous woman or person of color in the entire building. But that doesn't mean you have to change who you are. And so that's why I wanted to create that concept. And I find that standing in that balance is has always been difficult. It's difficult every day we wake up. Every single day we wake up, we're having to explain to somebody, what we do during the spring equinox, what we eat, why we eat with the seasons, or why do we celebrate cranberry Thanksgiving. Like, there are all these different kinds of things that everybody's just curious to know. And it gets tiresome, gets extremely tiresome. But that's the balance, that's also a part of the balance. And the longer we can remain in the balance, because we have some of our relatives that have gone so far off into being professional that they have removed themselves from who they are as Indians. And but then that causes a destruction to the community. That causes one less person that has now become a role model to show, hey, it's okay, get rid of who you are and just be what they wanted us to be. And now we have less and less people within our community that are very proud in that. Then you have some people who have pushed off and said, well, we don't need an education. We don't want to learn this way. We don't want to do that. But they're not able to prosper in today's society. And we see that. So how do we be the balance? And I'm saying that to you too. You know what I mean? Working in this position, who has held your community and your culture, and you still know your language and your traditions, and you carry yourself like a traditional man, but you work in a professional environment. That's hard. But at the same time, kudos to you. And thank you for what you do, because we have to be able to do that. So social media, for one, it's a really cool photo. I know it would catch headlines. I know the young people would be like, wow, that's badass. Like, look at her, but that makes them proud. It makes other Native people proud. Like, wow, look at my boss Native friend. It helps to get rid of some of that oppression, because they then got to see someone that they look like that they can say, oh, I can do that too. Or, because for so long we saw Superman, we saw Wonder Woman, but they weren't us. You know what I mean? And we were able to see them have these both sides, right? But I think we have to be able to do the same for our community. And that's how we're going to not only make change in the community, but impact on the world, you know?
Hmm. Bringing our whole selves to the table.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfiltered.
At times, yeah, definitely at times unfiltered.
Yeah.
Professionally unfiltered.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for all those responses, and thank you for your time. If there's anything else you'd like to add in here before we close out, table is yours.
Yeah, well, I just wanted once again say thank you. This is really a big honor. I'm obviously on the East Coast. To have been recognized by a well-known accredited school such as yourself, an organization. It's a big honor. It just is kind of like just telling me that I'm headed in the right direction, and I just need to continue this work. And so I really hope that the answers that I have given are going to be able to be useful to anybody that's listening, and anybody that's working within any of these type of topics, that this might be able to then help them, which will eventually help the world. So thank you once again.
Thank you.